Well, thanks very much for that nice introduction, and thanks so much for the invitation, both to my brother-in-law, Lanny, who suggested me for this group, and so I'm really happy that he did. And I have to tell you that I'm just so hugely impressed that you could self-organize to get this many people out on a night to talk about privacy issues. I hear a lot, especially from politicians, and sometimes when you talk to people in the press, that nobody really cares very much about privacy anymore. But to see this many people come out on a night to talk and engage on some of those issues gives lie, I think, to that. And I think that there are many people that are interested and engaged, and I'm grateful that you are and that you came out to today's talk. So I titled the talk sort of Internet Privacy and Surveillance, a little bit responding to Scott McNeely, and it's a reference that some of you may be familiar with. I'll come back to it in just a sec. But yesterday, there was a story that appeared online. This one here, Data Pirates of the Caribbean, the NSA recording every cell phone call in the Bahamas. That's every cell phone call, and that's not metadata in this case, so it's not the basic information around the number and location and time of the call and things like that. That's every call. That's all the content of every single call that comes in and out of that country, and it keeps about 30 days worth of calls and then kind of flushes it on an ongoing basis. This particular report, and it comes in part from Glenn Greenwald, who many of you will know has been at the heart of the Snowden reporting over the last almost year, reports that this is one of a number of countries where the NSA is engaged in this kind of activity. Now, I start with this in part because it seems to me that had this story appeared a year ago, this would have been a major international news story where we would have seen coverage in the New York Times and the Globe and Mail and, in papers and news media around the world. The very notion that one government's spy agency, surveillance agency, was in the process of capturing all calls, hundreds of millions of calls that take place on an annual basis, recording all of their content, and doing so not just for that country, but for a number of other countries, would have, I think, sparked an enormous amount of backlash and discussion around that issue. This story generated practically nothing. And it's not just this story. We could go back to any number of stories that we've seen over the last number of weeks or months. The kinds of stories about Yahoo's web chatting being captured, where millions of web chats being captured, any number of different stories, and we'll talk about a number of them over the course of the evening, that on their own would have been huge stories generating significant amount of controversy, creating, I think, a real discussion and concern about activities that are taking place. And yet this story, like so many others, now generates almost nothing because in part, our ability to surprise around these issues has been almost entirely lost, and that there is a sense that Scott McNeely, when he said already more than a decade ago, "You have no privacy, get over it," may have been, I think, in the views of many, proven right. I think that there are a lot of people that have, in a sense, just given up. When they see what has taken place over the last number of years, often and almost entirely in secret, their sense is that McNeely, by and large, was right. You don't have any privacy. We just live in a sense, almost this post-privacy world, and that perhaps we ought to get over it. Now, I'm going to walk through what we're seeing taking place, particularly at a political and policy level in Canada, because there are activities and bills that are taking place in Canada right now that have major implications for these stories and for what the future of privacy looks like here in Canada. And I'll readily acknowledge that it's a fairly depressing talk. I'm not going to admit defeat yet, but McNeely is winning, I think, in the sense that when we take a look at, as I say, these kinds of stories, and when we take a look, as we will in just a couple of moments, at the kind of legislative initiatives that are taking place right now, I think it's pretty clear that not only have we lost much of what we thought we had with respect to privacy, but I'd argue if we look at some of the legislative initiatives that are underway right now, we are at risk of losing even more. I'll try to close with some amount of optimism, at least in the sense of some of the things that I think that we can do but be forewarned, it's a little dreary outside, and it's going to get a little dreary in here when we talk about where things are at from a legislative policy approach when it comes to privacy and surveillance. So McNeely 1, privacy nothing, if we start talking about the issue around lawful access, which is a very live issue right now in the House of Commons. I'm actually appearing next week before the Justice Committee on this specific issue. Let me take us back just a couple of steps with lawful access. We could actually go back over a decade because successive governments, and I think it's worth noting that this is not a liberal or conservative issue. It's a conservative government right now, but there were liberal governments that were moving forward with similar kinds of bills in the past. We could go back over a decade with respect to some of these legislative initiatives. We'll sort of, for an expedience sake, just go back to 2012, sort of the last before this current time attempt at lawful access. That's when the current government introduced, I always look at the slide because I got to get the title right, the Protecting Children from Internet Predators Act, a roughly 100-page bill that contained the reference to children just in the title and in one other occasion. It wasn't really a bill that had very much to do with protecting children at all. It was really this long-rumored lawful access or internet surveillance piece of legislation. Now, this legislation is probably best known for the public safety minister at the time, Vic Tays, who was asked about this bill the day before it was introduced. So if you take a look, it was introduced actually on Valentine's Day in 2012, on February the 14th. On the 13th, he was asked in the House of Commons about this bill. It was on the notice paper so that we knew it was going to be introduced, and there was a sense of where the government was going to move with it, and he was asked about the kind of concerns that the government was going to move towards increased powers from a surveillance perspective, and real questions about whether or not there was sufficient oversight as part of that. And Vic Tays quite infamously suggested to the member opposite that he could either stand with the government on this issue or stand with the child pornographers. Now, as it turned out, there were a lot of people that, if given that choice, said that they would side with the child pornographers. As hundreds of thousands of people took to the internet and took to elsewhere to voice their concern in the immediate aftermath of the introduction of this legislation. This is Open Media, the Vancouver-based group that had generated over 100,000 people to speak out against this bill. This actually comes from Ann Cavoukian, long-standing Ontario Privacy Commissioner, whose term is coming to an end soon, but was a vocal critic on this issue in particular, trying to rally many to speak out. And it's somewhat unusual to see a privacy commissioner take this approach, but Anne saw this issue as being sufficiently important and concerning that she felt that there was a need to rally the public as much as possible. This was the Liberal Party talking about don't creep your emails, also launching petitions against this stuff. So we had some of the more established players becoming active on this. My favorite, though, as part of all of this was a truly grassroots effort on Twitter. This was the Tell Vic Everything campaign. The idea being that if the government was going to engage in surveillance, you might as well just tell them everything anyway. And so people began to tweet out different things on Twitter about what they were doing or what they were up to with the hashtag #TellVicEverything. And this really did catch fire. My favorite by far is this one here. Hey, at Vic Tays, I lost an email from my work account yesterday. Can I get your copy? Which I have to say is really great to show you just how clever you can be in 140 characters to both have some humor and also send a really effective message about the concerns around this legislation. Vic Tays was asked about this. All of this took place roughly over the span of a week, and the public safety minister was asked about it just a couple of days later on Evan Solomon's show, The House, over the weekend. And Tays said that he found this campaign in particular, he said it was really funny. But of course, if you're a politician and they are laughing at you rather than with you, you're really sunk. And on this issue, the government was sunk, or at least it seemed that it was at that point in time. Within about a week and a half of the bill having been introduced, it put the pause button on the legislation. At first, it said it would send the bill to committee after first reading, which in legislative speak means that it was opening the bill up to any kind of changes that might be possible. Once a bill goes to second reading, it can only be changed based on the rough structure of the bill. If it goes earlier on, you can make whatever changes you like. And so the government's first position was, we'll open it up to full study and change whatever you like. Later on, it's recognized that still wasn't good enough. This was a broken, damaged piece of legislation, and the government decided not to move forward with it at all. Indeed, about a year afterward, the minister at the time, Rob Nicholson, then the justice minister, said, we're not moving forward with this legislation. And he said, and I quote, any attempts that we will continue to have to modernize the criminal code will not contain the measures in C-30. That was in the spring of 2013. That commitment lasted less than 6 months. As the new Justice Minister, our current Justice Minister, Peter MacKay, stood before this sign here. They seem to recycle the signs a little bit. Protecting our children, bringing forward new legislation, this time legislation not about protecting the people from internet predators, but instead a bill that is nominally about cyberbullying. And so it's a piece of legislation that you may have heard of, dealing with cyberbullying. And in this particular case, this bill has a number of provisions that do deal, actually one main provision that deals with cyberbullying, and there's a fair amount of debate as to how effective it is. It is a roughly 70-page bill. 2.5 pages are devoted to cyberbullying. The rest brings back much of what we had in that prior bill. Now, in fairness to the government, it doesn't bring back everything, and so there were particular provisions in the former lawful access bill that were of significant concern, particularly around the removal of the mandatory disclosure of personal information by internet providers, other intermediaries without court oversight, so they'd be required to disclose certain information without any court oversight. The government has removed some of that. They've also removed some of the requirements that internet providers would have to install surveillance capabilities within their network. Although I have to say, in the post-Snowden environment, the notion of requiring them to have surveillance capability seems a little quaint, given how much we know about surveillance that takes place today. Yet what remains is itself still concerning. So the government often will reference the fact that the powers that are in the bill are all still subject to court oversight. And yet in some instances, the level of oversight that exists is far lower than we would otherwise find. So to give you an example, and apologize for all the legal speak, there is what is referred to in the law as or the bill as a transmission data warrant. That is, in more tech speak or more normal speak today, metadata. And so this is a warrant to allow for access to metadata. You can see some of the kinds of things that it captures related to the functions of dialing, routing, and the like. The government has been insistent that this is nothing to be concerned about, that metadata does not involve the content of the message. It is just all sorts of information about the message itself. Yet as Michael Hayden, the former CIA director in the United States, recently said, we kill people based on metadata. The use of metadata in any number of instances can be enormously revealing. Indeed, in some instances, more revealing than the content of the conversations themselves. And yet the government itself, in this instance, has a reason to suspect standard, the very last bullet on the page, which is below the typical standard that we have for warrants. It will be easier to get this information, it will be easier to get this warrant than it is for most other standard warrants. Now, there are other warrants as well, ones for preservation and production. The basic notion of allowing for the collection of all of this information, the requiring of internet providers then to preserve that information for periods of time, and then ultimately to produce it or make it available. And so this is with court oversight. Let's be clear, these are warrants, and yet the standards that apply in this case aren't nearly as strong as we might otherwise expect. Perhaps even more concerning, though, and the subject of much discussion already, is that though they have removed the mandatory disclosure of information, they have created new immunities for internet providers where they disclose voluntarily. And so the law, to backtrack just a bit, privacy law in Canada today would allow someone who has collected your personal information to disclose it without court oversight on a voluntary basis if a lawful authority comes to them, if a police officer comes to them, someone investigating and says, this is part of a lawful investigation, would you be willing to hand over this information? Now, the intermediary has a couple of options. They can turn to the person asking for this information and saying, we don't provide our customers data or their personal information without a warrant. Come back with a warrant and we will provide everything that we are required to. Or they can voluntarily comply. Now, sometimes they do. Although we don't know how much, we do know, if you've been following the news, that internet providers on an aggregate basis a couple of years ago were asked 1.2 million times for personal information and complied, and on a voluntary, warrantless basis on 750,000 user accounts in Canada. Hundreds of thousands of people are having their personal information disclosed on a voluntary basis. And yet many of these companies are still somewhat concerned about potential liability arising out of this, and what the government is seeking to do in this bill lying behind all this legalese is providing them with full immunity, both criminal liability and civil liability, no class actions, no lawsuits for the voluntary disclosure of their information under this law. So they're not requiring the disclosure, but they're doing everything they can to create the incentives necessary to allow for these disclosures without the court getting involved, because they can do so with full immunity from any further liability. It's McNeely 1, privacy nothing. He's going to go up 2-0. This feels like the Canadians-Rangers game from the other night. He's going to go up 2-0 when we start talking about the Digital Privacy Act, Bill S4, which is the government's latest attempt to update or reform our private sector privacy legislation, or PIPEDA, which you may have heard of, the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. And so PIPEDA actually took effect initially in 2001, took broader effect in 2004, and the government built into the law a mandatory review every 5 years. And so back in 2006, the government held a review and provided a series of recommendations about this legislation that they thought were in need of change. We move pretty slow when it comes to providing new kinds of protection, though, because here we are sitting in 2014, and they're finally getting around to what is now the third attempt at updating the law. Now, it's the new Industry Minister, James Moore, that has introduced this, and the bill is called the Digital Privacy Act. And in fairness to the minister, in fairness to the government, there are some things that are pretty good. There are housekeeping changes that the business community has long been asking for, business definitions and the like that will make various transactions easier, but that's what they were interested in. Of greater interest are security breach disclosure requirements. So you'll be familiar with these, I'm sure, where if an organization suffers some sort of security breach, especially in the United States, right now we often have laws in place that require a notification of those who are affected. It came actually out of Berkeley Law School. Initially came up with the idea, and it creates a really nice incentive structure where the incentive for the organization is to do a better job securing the information they collect, less they have to disclose to thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions of people, that their information has been lost. It's something they don't want to see happen. That's a nice incentive. It's also good for those who are affected, that they can take steps just in case they might be subject to identity theft or some other, their information may be misused. We don't have that law on a broad base in Canada, although we have in pockets in some provinces for certain kinds of information, mandatory disclosure for breaches. We do have this in Bill S4. And so I'm not going to go through all the detailed specifics, though we can get into it during question period if you like. What's important to note is that this legislation does include it. It's perhaps not as strong as it might be in some other places in terms of the standard of when a business would be required to disclose and the steps that they would undertake as part of that. But I think many say that this is a pretty good first step, and indeed there's reason to believe a number of business groups are going to fight against this, arguing that there should not be these requirements, which itself represents a big problem. The real problem that many are fearful of, though, is an expansion of warrantless disclosure. And so I mentioned a couple of moments ago that as it stands now under the law, it is open to an internet provider, let's say a telecom company, we could think of almost any intermediary, it's not just in the telecom internet space, to disclose on a voluntary basis to law enforcement. So if a lawful authority comes and says, we'd like access to this information, they can disclose. What Bill S4 seeks to do is expand that to allow them to disclose really to anybody. Which, must admit, I don't quite understand why the government thinks that's an appropriate standard to establish within the law. And yet if we read this, and I'm sorry, I'm going to try to read it, an organization may disclose personal information without the knowledge or consent of an individual if it's made to another organization. And so another organization is any third party in this case, where what they're doing is investigating a breach of an agreement, a contravention of a law that's either being committed or is about to be committed. And if they were to disclose this fact to the affected individual, the individual might not be all that happy about it. It would compromise the investigation. Let me parse that out for a moment, because what that is effectively saying is that if you've got an organization that thinks someone is breaching a contract or is about to violate a law, think, for example, of copyright infringement, and the prospect we just had fairly recently where we had Voltage Pictures engage in what a lot of people believe to be a trolling case, where they were looking for the subscriber information on more than 2,000 internet users on the ISP TechSavvy, not necessarily to go ahead and sue them. They haven't actually tried to sue them yet, but rather first just to identify who they are, and then later to send them demand letters for the purposes of demanding thousands in compensation, in this case for downloading a single film. Now, in that particular case, what TechSavvy said was, we're not prepared to disclose this information directly to you, the identity of our subscribers, but if a court orders us to do it, then we'll obviously require to follow whatever a court tells us to do. And what they ensured was that their subscribers were aware of these demands, and they provided an opportunity for interveners to come forward and at least raise some of the privacy issues. And in fact, a clinic that I started at the University of Ottawa called CIPIC, the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, intervened in the case to raise some of the privacy issues that would be raised by disclosing the subscriber information for roughly 2,000 subscribers in a single go. And so the court ultimately has issued the order, but so far they haven't taken them up on that. They haven't actually asked for this information and move forward with demand letters. I raise all of this by way of background because if this becomes law, they could, in theory, go to companies like TechSavvy and say, we believe that there are subscribers who have infringed copyright, which is a violation of your user agreement, their contract. We'd like you to tell us who they are. Now, TechSavvy would be within their rights under these changes to simply disclose all of that information without any court order. And of course, it's not just copyright. It could be any situation where someone believes that an agreement either has been breached or even is about to be breached. It could be this law, it could be other provincial laws and the like. It's incredibly broad in scope, and it takes what is already too broad when we think of the law with respect to warrantless disclosure to law enforcement, and now it brings it to everybody else. That doesn't sound like a Digital Privacy Act to me. In many ways, it sounds like one that is taking away some of the last bits of privacy that we otherwise have. McNeely's up 2-0 now, and he's going to go up 3-0 with respect, of course, to Snowden. Now, it is hard, I think, in many ways, to get a full handle on just how large and how big this has become. And as I mentioned off the very top, when we take a look at the individual stories that are coming almost on a drip basis, on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, it is incredible to see just the scope of what has occurred. Indeed, Greenwald has said that if the current pace of disclosures continue, which has been roughly once a week, although as I say, sometimes it is more frequent than that, they'll be disclosing these stories for 45 years. There is so much information that is now, that Greenwald and a number of other, Barton Gellman and a number of other journalists have, that was taken through Edward Snowden from the NSA, that we are talking about potentially decades of disclosures about the kinds of programs that are out there. Now, many of you will be familiar with part of this, but just to cycle through just some of what we have seen. What started first with disclosures around the NSA collecting millions of phone records from Verizon, and it turns out from any number of other US-based subscribers. Mining data through the PRISM program from lots of other internet-based companies, and you note there that they're talking both about US and British intelligence. Hopefully people here know that Canada is part of what is known as Five Eyes, a consortia of intelligence agencies that includes the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And so very often when we see the documents that have been revealed by Snowden, they're often for Five Eyes only, is sort of the terminology that is used on the documents that makes clear that Canada is an active participant in all of this and has access to much of the same kinds of information. Many of the tech companies initially denying some of their activity as part of this, yet it's clear that their information's been collected. Bulk collection of email records going back more than 2 years, millions and millions of these records. The NSA saying oftentimes that they are not searching content, and yet some of these documents suggesting that in fact they are. Billions being spent on all of this, and yet almost all the budgets that are devoted to this is in a sense a black box. We don't know how it is being spent. Indeed, we know, for example, that the NSA provides money to their Canadian counterparts, CSEC, here in Canada, with money being given for some of these same kinds of surveillance activities here in Canada, with the NSA effectively funding their activities here in our own country. And yet when asked about it, as I'm sure many know, the NSA has often sought to cover this up, both in the documents as well as in appearances before Congress. Spying activities, which I suppose doesn't come as much of a surprise, but very often spying against allies, spying, as we saw, against large numbers of individuals, huge amounts being spent, as we've seen, and then even going at the very heart of the security infrastructure that all of us rely upon. So, and as an example, and one in which Canada again played a complicit role, the development of an encryption standard of which Canada was the chair within this committee, the NSA using Canada's chair position to undermine and provide a backdoor within that standard. Now this affects, of course, not just everyday individual internet users, it affects technology companies, and many whom now acknowledge that they are losing billions of dollars as the trust in these technologies from many other governments, many other countries has really been decimated in a sense by many of these revelations. And as I've alluded to already, Canada plays a pretty significant role in all of this. And so CSEC, which is our counterpart to the NSA, has a CSEC commissioner that nominally is supposed to provide oversight to this. There have been reports that there is little in many instances that they can do. For example, there has been a long-promised report on CSEC's role with metadata, which, as I mentioned, can be used akin to and in some ways more effectively than content itself. That report, as was promised 7 years ago, and yet still hasn't been forthcoming, still hasn't been released. Indeed, we do know from little bits, sometimes from access to information requests, sometimes through some of the documents that we've seen from Snowden, that the government itself internally has struggled with some of these issues. And so at times, some of the Canadian programs within the government, there is some recognition that they may have gone offside what the law really has suggested is appropriate. And yet, at the moment, there is a green light for it. McKay, back when he was National Defense Minister, allowed for that in 2011. And by allowing for these metadata programs, what is clear is that it opens the door to just a wide range of activities, some of which I think the politicians themselves might not have suspected that this would happen. So we've seen a number of reports specifically on that. We know Canada's been involved in some of the same kind of spying activities, recent disclosures about Canada spying in Brazil with their mining department, which is hard, frankly, to understand because there isn't a clear conduit between government spy activities and the private sector. This is supposed to be for national security purposes, which can include economic purposes, but the idea of spying on economic grounds to then provide access to that information to the business community, the Canadian, let's say, mining community, it's not clear how any of that could even happen from a legal perspective. Here in Toronto, of course, we now know about the spying that took place during both the G8 and the G20, with the NSA essentially allowed to set up shop here in Toronto and engage in widespread surveillance on those activities, so the NSA engaged in all of that. That's a sense of what's happening, and we could layer on top of that. It's almost too much to keep pace with as we see the stories coming out of the US, and then even recently stories, the airport Wi-Fi story, and a range of others here in Canada as well. Which really in some ways suggests that if we're down 3-0, so to speak, is it game over? And as I say, there are many, I think, who would take a look at this and say, we know now about widespread surveillance that goes beyond what I think many envisioned. We've got laws that have, at a minimum, permitted this and in some instances facilitated this. And now we have government proposing even more changes that might well allow for an expansion of some of these disclosures, whether we're talking about surveillance or privacy. That's a pretty bleak set of circumstances. And so what I want to spend my last minutes on is talking about what we can do. Because I don't think it's over yet, and I don't think McNeely is going to win, at least not win by a shutout. I think there's a lot that we can do as individuals. I think there's a lot that government can be doing as it hopefully rethinks and begins to address some of these kinds of issues. And I do believe that Canadians are more concerned, are more interested in these issues than government sometimes wants to believe. Though I should start sort of my list of 10 by noting that I met with a senior official, I recall, within government fairly early on in the Snowden leaks. And this person, we were meeting about something else, but we started talking about surveillance because it was at the time capturing some of the headlines that in certain respects, as I mentioned, have disappeared now. And his view was, he said, listen, personally, I'm pretty troubled by some of this stuff that I'm reading, especially out of the United States. But from a political perspective, and I'm paid to look at this from a political perspective, I have to tell you that I don't see a lot of risk unless we're seen to be lying on an issue. Canadian public, by and large, is going to trust us more than they're going to trust certainly some of the technology companies that are collecting some of the same kinds of data. And by and large, unless we mislead, we think we're pretty safe. Now that was early on in the process, before we've seen now months of successive revelations, before in fact there were any revelations that directly implicated Canada and Canadian involvement in these issues. So it is certainly possible that at least some of that political analysis has changed. But at the same time, the truism that at least within Ottawa, the perspective or the prism on which much of this will be viewed is, does it hurt us politically? And it is only going to hurt them politically if enough Canadians say enough. If enough Canadians say that when we take a look at this, this runs counter to what we believe is appropriate, to what we believe is right when it comes to striking a balance between ensuring that we are adequately protected in our security and ensuring that we have an appropriate level of privacy as well. So what can we do? What can the government do? First, it can deal with some of the oversight-related concerns. And so in Canada at the moment, part of the problem that we have, I would argue, is that especially on the Snowden-style surveillance activities, the kind of oversight that exists just isn't nearly strong enough. If we compare it to other jurisdictions, including the United States, they have at least some of their elected officials play an active role as part of this. We don't have that. We entrust almost everything in this CSEC commissioner that, as I mentioned a few moments ago, some say isn't nearly powerful enough. And while the commissioner himself has been at pains to say, no, I feel that I've got enough power, I've got enough access, I can say what I need to say, I think many look at the situation and say that it's almost entirely inside baseball. It's almost entirely a commissioner that is largely invisible to most Canadians, who operates largely in secret without our elected officials playing really any role at all. And so we don't say no, I don't think, to any kind of surveillance activity. I think there's a recognition that security does mandate in some instances that some of these activities take place. But surely oversight has to be commensurate with those kinds of activities, and at the moment, our oversight systems just are sorely lacking. So too, second, are the powers that our privacy commissioner has. And this is particularly true at the federal level. If we compare what exists today at a provincial level, where commissioners like Anne Cavoukian here in Ontario or Liz Denham in British Columbia they have order-making power. And so they've got the ability where there are instances where there are violations of the law to go into an organization and say, not only is this going to stop, but I've got the power to ensure that you do stop, and that will include, of course, some kind of penalties. At the federal level, at least for now, although this may change in part through Bill S4, there is no order-making power. And so what the Privacy Commissioner is able to do for the moment is issue non-binding findings. Now, I can tell you that this is for people, particularly even small cases, which small in the sense that they aren't national in scope, but very big to the individuals who are affected. This can be an incredibly frustrating and discouraging process. From time to time, I get emails from people who have filed complaints under Canada's privacy legislation, instances where they feel a bank has disclosed some of their account information to a former partner, and they feel truly violated when that takes place, or other instances where their personal information is disclosed in violation of the law. They file a complaint, they cooperate with investigators, And roughly 12 months later, what they get is a letter from the Privacy Commissioner. It usually runs about a page and a half, although if it's a detailed investigation, it might run a little bit longer, in which the Commissioner will assess what took place, and if they are successful, will say, I have a well-founded finding. And then if you are someone whose privacy has been violated, you say, okay, and what else? And there is no and what else. The only what else you get is they say, if you are unsatisfied with this letter, you can go to the federal court. And if you go to the federal court will say, well, we're going to start from scratch in this case. So lawyer up, because now you're actually in a process where the lawyers are going to get engaged, and the federal court will look at this, what is called de novo. They will look at this as new from scratch, and you'll have to go through the same process again, potentially taking any number of years before there is any possibility of real compensation as part of this process. Now, in other jurisdictions, the Commissioner has order-making power, where there are real penalties associated with what takes place. We don't have that yet. Bill S4 does envision what are known as compliance agreements, so the Commissioner can negotiate these agreements, in which case an organization can agree to abide by the law, so it's moving in that direction, but without the finality of an order-making power. In the case of many private sector organizations, they'd rather just fight it because the Commissioner just doesn't have much power. If we're serious about privacy, we've got to ensure that those who are charged with enforcing the law have the powers to make sure that it matters. We have to deal with metadata, number 3. As I mentioned, we've had any number of instances where there have been clear acknowledgments that metadata can be more powerful, can be more revealing than the content of messages themselves. And yet what we have in Canada, what we have in other jurisdictions, is effectively a blanket opening to collect metadata, as much metadata as you like, and use it in whatever way you like, because what we repeatedly hear from elected officials, as recently as last week, as part of the committees before the House of Commons, is that metadata doesn't matter. Well, we have enough knowledge now that data mining technologies collecting large amounts, massive amounts of this information, that even a number of years ago would have been largely unimaginable, and that the data mining technologies themselves simply didn't exist in a way that could render this information as relevant as it is today. Yet today we know that that's precisely where we are, and yet the standards, the privacy protections that we have accorded this kind of information simply do not measure up. We've got to begin to treat this information in the same way that we treat other information that is viewed in many instances as highly sensitive. We need far better transparency from our telecom companies. And indeed, in the United States, we have seen some of the larger providers there, under pressure in a post-Snowden environment, begin to issue transparency reports that reveal how many times disclosures are requested and how many times they actually provide those disclosures. These do not affect the investigations. It is information that is provided on an aggregate basis. And yet, when Canada's major telecom companies, when Bell and Telus and Rogers were asked, just in the last number of months by a group of researchers led by Christopher Parsons at the University of Toronto, to disclose this kind of information, they all flatly refused. Not a single one was willing to disclose how many times they are asked for our information, nor how many times they are disclosed it. They disclose it. Now, the one big data point, and I mentioned it earlier on, the 1.2 million requests combined with the 750,000 user accounts, that came up only after the Privacy Commissioner in 2011 asked for that information, and I think rather remarkably, all the telecom companies responded at first by saying, no way. That's how powerful our Privacy Commissioner is. And said, well, I'm investigating this, I'd like this information, and every single one of them says, I'm not willing to provide it to you. The best they were able to achieve was to say, we will take this information on an aggregate basis, provide it to you. In fact, I ultimately obtained some of this data through an access to information request, in which some of the back and forth between companies like Bell and the Privacy Commissioner's office was they were concerned that not enough companies were providing this data, and they were concerned that they might become personally identifiable. No little irony there, that they are concerned about their own, in a sense, privacy and being identified, and yet have little trouble, as we learn, disclosing the information of individual subscribers again and again and again, hundreds of thousands of times every year. There is no reason that those same companies couldn't move towards telecom transparency reports similar to what some of the internet companies like Google and Twitter have engaged in, so that at least we have a sense of what's taking place. Because at the moment we go to the telecom companies, they say go to the government says, well, we're not talking, but if you like, you can go to the telecom companies and ask them and see if they'll disclose. It's a neat little game, but it leaves all of us with no privacy at all. We need to fix consent so that consent is meaningful in today's environment. So much of the law today is premised on the notion that if you consent to your information being collected, used, and disclosed, then it's fair game. People can use it in whatever way they like. And yet the reality of the law today is that in many instances, it is opt-out based consent. People get your data, they can use it as they see fit, and until you say, please stop, they can continue to use it in many different ways. And we, of course, know things like the tracking that takes place online through widgets and any number of other sorts of technologies that allows us to be tracked as we move around online. Now, there are efforts in what is, I think, largely a much maligned bill, often unfairly, the anti-spam legislation, that actually seeks to reverse some of this and move us towards an opt-in world, one in which we say, I have to say yes before you begin to use my information. That really strengthens consent, I think, in a serious way. It's why many in the business community feel threatened by this legislation, but it's precisely the road that we need to go. As an example, the legislation actually includes, at the very end, a little provision that allows the government to kill the do not call list, where there are more than 12 million numbers, as you may know, registered on the do not call list, though there are exceptions for just about everybody. So other than air duct cleaners and a couple of others that seem to call regularly, almost everybody gets to continue to call under this do not call list. And when I saw this provision, I said, well, why is the government going to kill this do not call list? It might not be all that effective, but at least it's proven pretty popular. And the government and people within the government responded, well, if we move to a world where it is opt-in rather than opt-out, we don't need a do not call list anymore, because by default, all numbers are do not call. Instead, what you have to create is a do call list, because people have to opt into that. That's the right direction, I think, in many respects, but it's going to take some time to get there. We need to think about not just our laws, but the laws elsewhere. And so in the United States, the first response you may have seen from the Obama administration, as well as many from the NSA, when they started talking about what the NSA was engaged in, and our CSEC says much the same, is don't worry, people in the United States. We're not tracking you. We're tracking everybody else. Well, everybody else is us, right? We're part of what is getting tracked. And we say the same thing to our own citizens. Don't worry, CSEC's mandate is only outside the jurisdiction. And yet we know that, especially within a Five Eyes environment, where it's everybody gets to track everybody else, it's pretty clear that everybody ultimately gets tracked. All of this data ultimately gets collected. And so we have to be thinking not just about how we improve some of our own laws, but I would argue so too, laws elsewhere. So that the notion, for example, in the United States, where the largest data collector of all, the NSA, is able to somehow credibly say, don't worry about the constitutional rights in the United States, we just collect people who don't have those same kind of rights. Well, the laws ought to be changed in that regard. And if we want to talk about trade issues, if we're so worried about things like Keystone and other sorts of things with the United States, this should be a trade issue too. This creates for us and for some of our companies serious risks and serious problems. And so if we want to talk about trade barriers that exist, data collection where Canadians are affected in a way that is different from those in the United States ought to be treated in much the same manner. Frankly, and this is a lawyer talking, we need lawsuits. We've seen lots of these in the United States by the ACLU and other groups. There is one that has been launched here in Canada by the BC Civil Liberties Association, but we often know that the only way to actually get movement on some of these issues is to force things to go through the courts, and so we need to support the organizations that are willing to do this, whether that's the BC Civil Liberties Association or potentially soon the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, groups that are going to say if the government is ill-prepared or unprepared to move, we're going to take this before the courts and get our federal courts, potentially even our Supreme Court, to begin to address and examine some of these issues. We need to fix not just private sector privacy legislation, but also the Privacy Act. This is legislation that governs how the government, when it collects personal information, what takes place. And we've seen a number of reports recently there too, where we know some of this information being disclosed, sometimes by CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, and other groups. And what is striking is that this legislation is so outdated, it dates back to the 1980s, and has never been amended. And so the government, at least on the private sector side, is willing to set a certain standard and seek to improve in some areas, although diminish in others. When it comes to the standards that it sets for itself, the data that it collects amongst the myriad of programs that exist within government, it hasn't changed the standard that it requires itself to meet in decades, and surely it should do so. Even worse in many respects are political parties, which is largely a no-law land. And this is true for all the political parties, not a partisan issue. We know the large databases the Conservatives have on user and voter activities. We know that the Liberals and the NDP racing to do much the same kind of thing. And yet all of those parties take the position, credibly, that PIPEDA, the private sector privacy legislation, does not apply to this collection of data because this is not commercial activity. And the Privacy Act does not apply because political parties are not government, they are political parties. They're separate and apart from the government itself. And so we have what are amongst some of the most detailed databases that are out there that political parties amass, where they try to identify not just directly, but as they go to the door, as they monitor and take a look at what takes place in social media, people's voting preferences, people's voting habits, to the extent to which they are able to discern that from any number of activities, and try to create detailed profiles on all of this, and yet none of this is subject to any kind of legal restrictions or limitations. All we're left with is sort of just a good faith that the parties will somehow respect our privacy interests and our privacy rights. Well, surely that is not good enough, and yet this is amongst the most thorniest and challenging issues that are out there, because none of the parties are lining up to say we are willing, in a sense, to limit some of us and restrict some of the data collection that we are engaged in. And finally, we've got to fix this legislation, and that is where I think, at least for the moment, we all come in. These bills, Bill C-13, the lawful access legislation, is before the House of Commons right now. Bill S-4 is before the Senate right now, and I was actually just speaking to someone within government earlier today, and they are moving quickly to move on that bill as well, with hearings scheduled within the next week or so. So these laws, expanding things like warrantless disclosure beyond just law enforcement, creating voluntary immunity, creating immunity for voluntary disclosures, setting low thresholds for warrants. I mean, this is what our privacy laws might look like in the future, and this legislation is before the House now. Now, it was mentioned off the top with my biography that one of the issues that I focused a lot on for many years was on copyright. And one of the sort of the most intriguing and in many ways surprising pieces of data that I got as I learned about the sort of the world of advocacy and trying to speak out on some of these issues was a discussion I had, and it was repeated in a number of instances with members of parliament or people who worked for members of parliament. And the question was, how many people from your riding did it take for you to begin to pay attention to an issue? And I have to say that I thought the number was going to be hundreds or thousands of people. They needed to, just get buried with correspondence from angry Canadians saying, we won't vote for you, or we're concerned about this, and we want you to begin to pay attention and reconsider some of your positions on this. In that the number wasn't thousands, it wasn't even hundreds. According to any number of people, what they needed was to hear from two. If there were two people that took the time from within the riding, not from outside, so people that take the time to write every AstroTurf, every single MP, anybody who's got a postal code that isn't part of the postal codes within the riding of the MP, that goes in the blue bin. But for everybody else, where they are in the riding, if there are two people within the riding that take the time to write, there is a recognition politically that behind those two lie many others that may be equally concerned but haven't taken the time to write or to call or to reach out to their members of parliament and express their concern about where that legislation is going. I don't think it's too much to ask for two people in riding after riding after riding to say, hey, I'm concerned. And if we can get 2 or 20 or 200 or 2,000 to say, this is a matter that concerns me. Now note that for both of these bills, it seems very unlikely that either will fully pass all the parliamentary requirements by the end of the summer, which means our elected officials will be back in your riding this summer at barbecues, at community events, trying to curry favor and spend time talking to you and any number of other people, knowing that an election is less than a year away. Take the time to either write to them, take the time to meet them, and say, I know about these bills, and I'm concerned about these bills, and I think things need to change. Thanks very much for your attention.
So we'll be taking some questions for Michael. Okay, right up front.
I've noticed in the House of Commons, some bills get passed really quickly and some bills take months, if not maybe sometimes years. Yeah. And they're just as equally important sometimes. Can you explain why that is, how some bills get rushed through and some bills seem to take forever to pass?
Sure. Well, we have a majority government, and so our majority government gets to decide how quickly things go and whether bills are a priority. So there are some bills that become priorities and they're able to rush through, and people may have noticed they invoke something known as closure to try to limit the amount of debate associated with that legislation. In other instances, bills can just lag, and sometimes can lag for months. Indeed, the predecessor to Bill S4, the prior piece of privacy legislation, was introduced a couple of years ago, sat and didn't go anywhere at all. And I mean, the reason for that is the government took a look at this and decided it wasn't particularly important or wasn't enough of a priority to allocate time. There is a sense as well that as the Privacy Commissioner, the former Privacy Commissioner, Jennifer Stoddart, looked at the bill and found real concerns, the government wasn't all that keen on bringing forward a privacy bill that was going to be criticized by their own Privacy Commissioner. But, I mean, by and large, it's really just a political calculus that they're making about some issues that they think will benefit and others that they're just less concerned with.
Okay, we have a question in this corner over here, Michael.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, proactive government. You mentioned that there was ATIP. Okay. My proactive disclosure is I do work for the federal government, but you mentioned before there's ATIP at federal level and there's PIPEDA for the private sector. Is there anything for the nonprofit sector?
I'm sure I understand. So, well, ATIP is access to information, but what's so?
And Privacy Act.
Yeah, no, there's the, yes, okay, we've got the Privacy Act. Is there anything for the
sector?
Oh, from a privacy perspective, sorry.
Yeah.
So I mean, it raises a really good question. So we've got this constitutional complication in Canada when it comes to privacy, because arguably privacy law belongs to the provinces from a constitutional perspective. They have powers over property and civil rights. And so the compromise that was struck in Canada with PIPEDA was that the federal government would enact broad private sector privacy legislation, but limit it just to commercial activities, and that everything else would fall to the provinces, plus the provinces would be free to enact their own private sector privacy legislation that could be more all-encompassing than the federal version. So what we've got is a bit of a patchwork today, where there are a number of provinces that do have private sector privacy laws that would encompass some of those activities: Quebec, Alberta, British Columbia. We have the federal law that applies elsewhere. We even have some provinces that have more narrow laws, like health privacy laws we have in Ontario. But for everything else, it falls to the private sector law applies. Now, for nonprofits, where they engage in some commercial activity, it is possible that some of their activities may fall under that, but for the most part, you're right to point out that they, by and large, fall outside the rules.
Okay, one back here.
First of all, thank you very much, Michael. I remember studying much of your stuff in university a few years ago, not that long ago. My question, and I may be opening a can of worms, you mentioned earlier about the do not call list and how it should be an opt-in. How do you find that relating to the CASL that's coming in for July 1st? Mm-hmm. Should they go that way? Do you have thoughts on, in the 2 seconds that you can do, thoughts on that or how that can affect us?
Yeah, so, no, it's not opening a can of worms at all. The legislation, as I mentioned, envisions the possibility of canceling or doing away with the do not call list. I think it also recognizes, though, that there is a bit of an adjustment phase until we get to the point of dealing with things like CASL, the anti-spam legislation. So I don't foresee the government doing away with the do not call list anytime soon. I think that will take time for Canadian organizations to become more comfortable with their new obligations under the anti-spam law. But if we think ahead 3 years, 5 years, and optimistically think that there will be broad compliance and the threats of constitutional challenges and stuff like that will have either played themselves out or people will have found that, in fact, the legislation isn't quite as onerous as it's sometimes made out to be, then perhaps we'll be in a position to do that. But for the moment, I think the two will coexist. The bigger question, I think, for a lot of organizations right now is the anti-spam legislation, which does require change, make no mistake about it. Though for any organization that already maintains lists, I hope that you're compliant with PIPEDA. So I hope that when people add, that you maintain the lists and you maintain opt-out requests and the like. You're still required now to maintain lists. You're still required to maintain many of those same kind of rules. There are some additional requirements, but it isn't as far a jump as some at times have suggested.
Aside from the obvious emotive effects, why do you think there's this conflating of child pornography and censorship and privacy issues?
That's pretty much the only reason. The government, I think, has been looking. I don't think surveillance sells, in the sense that I think if the government were to call this the Surveillance Act, and here's the new kinds of surveillance powers that we're bringing in, it would prove all that popular. But cyberbullying is a hot issue at the moment, and one that is of genuine concern, I think. But it is striking that the government strategy of trying to frame it in this way and presumably hope that it would curry favor with the public backfired, at least to a certain extent, just last week when Amanda Todd's mother appeared before the committee and said that she was concerned with the privacy aspects or implications of the legislation and asked the government to separate or bifurcate out the cyberbullying provisions from the remaining provisions. Government didn't seem all that receptive, but at a minimum, I thought that it was a pretty courageous thing to do, but I also think it was a pretty honest thing to do, to sort of say that, yes, obviously I'm concerned with cyberbullying and some of the issues that raises, but the overwhelming majority of this bill has nothing to do with any of that.
Hi. In terms of open data, one of the things that comes up a lot when the community or citizens request data from the government to say, hey, we want this data, the response from the government will be, we can't because there's privacy implications. Mm-hmm. And so just from the community perspective, I don't know if the privacy community is starting to advise government on what they should do. I'm just trying to understand how the community can kind of understand when that's a valid response and when it's not true. Because there's a lot of technology that you can use to get around these things.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it's a super complicated issue. In fact, my column this week, and you probably saw, not the column, but the story, involves the Google decision out of Europe with the right to be forgotten and the prospect of removing search results, not removing the content itself, but rather the search results itself. And so that issue around publicly available data, not just government open data, publicly available data more generally, is fraught with complication and a real challenge. In fact, I sit on the board of CANLI, the Canadian Legal Information Institute, which brings all of Canada's decisions and laws, or as many as we can, out and makes them openly and freely available. And we have faced an increasing number of issues around the availability of judgments, which at the moment have some amount of obscurity because most courts actually ask that this not be indexed by Google, and yet there's been at least one instance where someone has hoovered up large numbers of these decisions, made them available, and now people are realizing that this is online. So anyways, so to get to your actual question. First off, privacy is often used as an excuse within government for things that they say we can't do this or we can't do that because of privacy, and oftentimes it is exactly that. It's an excuse, and it is in fact not based on the law. And so in many instances there may be the consents. You may need consents, or consents may already be there, but the notion that, oh, it's privacy is sort of like this third rail, so we can't do anything, is often simply just not the case. In other instances, though, more directly with open data, this issue of lots of information, we want to make it openly available, add value, do all kinds of different things with it that the government at the moment oftentimes is not. But what happens when there's personal information that's there is challenging for sure. And so what we've done, what gets done, let's say in the court context, because I'm most familiar with that, is that you try to deal with the privacy issues at source, right? So where you got family law decisions, you try to anonymize those by using just initials so that the principles behind the decision can still be made available, but we don't need to know who the individuals are. That isn't particularly relevant. There are some who would argue that in a law context we actually should remove names altogether. That's not just for family instances, we ought to do more. But even there are still challenges to sometimes identify all of that. The view that many of us have taken on the board at CANARIE and within the legal community is that we want, once it's out there, we want to make sure it's out there and allow people to do whatever they like with it. And that we don't want to be in the habit of having to pull a lot of different stuff back, though occasionally mistakes get made. Where we're dealing with other forms of government data, it seems to me from what I do know, in the United States, sometimes there's more highly personal stuff in terms of voting records, health records, that sometimes are made available, that once you start matching up some of that data, that can be revealing in ways that might not otherwise be anticipated. I know researchers like Khaled Al-Amam at the University of Ottawa that looks at some of this stuff, says that the concerns aren't as pronounced in Canada as they are elsewhere, but I think it does represent a big issue, and one that in the same way that we want to strike balances on privacy and surveillance, I think we want to try to find ways to strike a balance there too.
Hi, Michael. I'm interested from a comparative perspective, if there's legislation or regulatory practices from other countries that you think we should adopt or that have lessons for us to learn.
Well, I mean, we could start by saying we're all screwed, and and so there is, I actually think that, so there are, and so we can look to some of the rules that we see in Europe, some of which are effective, some of which I think are woefully ineffective and overrated, but there are some elements within the European system that I think are better. We've seen other jurisdictions that have tried to establish better oversight as part of some of these, some of the surveillance activities too. So I think that there are opportunities, but most of the time, and I mean the question you ask is one that you get asked all the time by politicians, so who's doing it better? And I have to say that in many instances, what we learn from other countries is more about what not to do rather than what to do. And so what we learn in many instances is that where there are these mass kinds of data collection, whether it's this sort of surveillance, whether it's the video surveillance that you find in the UK, for example, where everywhere you look, it feels like there are cameras. There may be some good uses out of this, but we also know that in almost every instance, there will be abuses. There will be misuses, and it's not because anybody comes out with any sort of malintent, but because when you're collecting that much information and you've got so many different people engaged, mistakes, and sometimes it's not just mistakes, will happen. And so that you can't go in thinking that, well, these are our police, right? They've got our back. I mean, they're trying to protect us. Or these are people who are on the side of right in just about every instance. And they are, and that's true. But we also know that if we look at the examples, if we look at the experiences elsewhere, that mistakes are going to happen. And so when you say that, or when many of us say that we need appropriate oversight, when we need the courts to get engaged, when we need an appropriate standard on this, this is not out of any sort of ill will towards those that are engaged in activity or in any sense saying that unlawful activity is somehow okay. It's merely saying that if we take a look at what happens elsewhere, if we're going to try and engage in that, what can we learn from the experience elsewhere? We know that mistakes are going to happen, and so the way to stop that from happening is to build it better from the beginning while we've got that opportunity.
Hi, I'm well educated in the art and science of data mining, and as a result I govern my own behavior accordingly to protect my own privacy and educate anyone that I'm near. And I have a lot of friends that have been through divorces, and they're horrified that all kinds of information, everything, your social security number, all of your bank accounts, absolutely everything, your children, and some not very nice things are all for the public to view. All they need to do is go to 393 University. If I read about it in the newspaper and I see there's a divorce, all I need to do is go to 393 University and fill out a little piece of paper and put the name, and I can have access to it and do whatever I want with it. I can photocopy it, I can put it on the internet, I can do whatever I want with it. There's absolutely no privacy. You can't control that. You can control what your online behavior, but once you're involved in a court proceeding, you have absolutely no control, and it's completely and absolutely public.
Yeah, that's generally true, although, I mean, the court is in a position, as I mentioned, with family law judgments, is in a position to anonymize, and they often will, as a mechanism to try to protect the children and or the people who are involved in the case. And so I think there is a recognition about some of the sensitivities that are there, but you're right that there are any number of records that in the past had privacy largely just through obscurity. I mean, the notion that not everybody would go down to the courthouse to obtain records, and so the fact that these things were difficult to obtain and even more difficult to disseminate provided a certain layer of protection. Some of that is quite clearly lost. That's actually at the heart of this European Court of Justice decision on this right to be forgotten. The question or the challenge there is in the same sort of balancing, the balancing between both a freedom of expression issue, a right to information side, as well as a right to privacy side, and a question as to whether or not, if we deal solely with the search engines but don't deal with the underlying content, are we really solving anything at all? I mean, the irony in that particular case is that everything that, it's a Spanish individual that had filed this complaint over the fact that through Google, people were able to access advertisements that were roughly a decade old because he had owed money to Social Security or some such government program, and there was an auction of some of his assets. And so he goes to try to stop this from being disseminated, and the irony, of course, is that the judgment itself contains all of these details as part of this decision. And so the details of this particular individual's case is now far more broadly disseminated than than certainly had been the case before he decided to file the complaint. But you're right. I mean, these are difficult issues to reconcile and sort out.
Today, a few people, probably not too many, try to regain some of their communications privacy by encrypting everything. And of course, by as soon as they do that, they get considered to be potentially up to no good and subject to more surveillance, and perhaps not less. But that would stop if enough people did it. And I'm wondering whether you think that there's any reasonable possibility of that happening.
Well, we have seen certainly a spike in the usage of these encryption technologies, and I think you're absolutely right. I think the encryption technologies are very effective, especially for the mass surveillance that we're concerned with. You know, the response that we often get is, well, the NSA's got either backdoors or capabilities of accessing this if they really want it. But you know, if they really want it, by and large, that means that there is an invocation of some kind of court process, and we've got the kind of oversight built in that many would say that's okay. It's the mass indiscriminate surveillance that really, I think, raises the concerns of many, where you're in a sense guilty just by virtue of the fact that you're communicating. And there, you're quite right. And I think that using encryption technologies creates enough of a speed bump, in a sense, that at least for the moment, the hassle and the extra computing power that's necessary in trying to decrypt to access that information is only going to happen if there's a reason to suspect at a minimum, which is at least bringing us to a better threshold than we have right now. Will everybody use it? Even things like PGP are still not simple enough to use, I think, for the average internet user. Plus, of course, so many people rely upon web-based email like Gmail and the like. And of course, companies like Google could, if they wanted, use encryption for all of those transmissions. But the problem, of course, is if your business model is premised on scanning the messages themselves so that you can put out relevant advertising, encryption seems at odds with the business model.
Any remaining questions for Michael? Oh, yeah.
Maybe not encryption, but something like personal VPNs. Like there's services that you
Yes,
can.
there are.
Do you have a position on that one as to whether that's a good idea as we continue to work on the internet providers?
Yeah, I sit on the advisory board of SurfEasy, and they're really great. And they're here, and they're based here, and they're based here in Toronto, which I think is good. So yeah, so I mean, you can use those, and lots of and more and more people do. And I know some of the companies that are offering up some of those services have seen a massive spike in the activities. But I think we also ought to recognize that, yes, there is unquestionably a place to use these kinds of technologies, and I think that's part of a solution. But that, in my view, really runs the risk of creating a world of sort of digital haves and have-nots, where if you're sophisticated enough to use this, which is by and large a very small percentage of the population, then you're able to protect your privacy, but everybody else is kind of just out there. And let's recognize that if what we're really serious about is trying to target the bad guys, so to speak, the proverbial terrorists and the other groups out there, they're in that group that is sufficiently sophisticated to know how to use this and well beyond some of this. And so the idea that somehow there will still be a rationale for using these mass indiscriminate kinds of surveillance when we know that they're using encryption technologies, it's hard to reconcile those sorts of activities. I think we've got to get the law and policy right too, though, because in a sense we've got to protect all the remaining people out there who either aren't even aware of the risk, or even if they are, don't know where to begin in terms of trying to protect themselves.
So we have one last question at the back.
You mentioned that telcos are not the telecommunication companies are not disclosing the requests for whenever governments request information from them. I was wondering how effective do you find filing shareholder proposals on their agendas at the AGMs?
I think it's a great idea. I think there's a couple of things that we can do. One is sort of put the spotlight on it in those kind of high-profile environments and raise questions. The other thing that you can do is you can ask. And so one of the things that PIPEDA provides, the private sector privacy law provides, is that you've got a right of access. In the same way you can file an access to information request with the government, you can in a sense file a similar kind of access to information request with pretty much any private sector organization that has your personal information. And in fact, Christopher Parsons, who I mentioned earlier, has a really useful blog post up at the Citizen Lab, which is part of the University of Toronto, that spells out exactly how to do that. So if you are interested in knowing whether or not your ISP or your wireless provider has ever disclosed information about you, there's a post out there that sort of specifies, almost provides a template for the request and the contact information for the company, and they are by law required to respond within 30 days. Now, they don't always respond within 30 days, but that's the goal. So there are at least a couple of things that we can do. But I do think that at the end of the day, it's sort of the public exposure of the fact that they're more interested in protecting their own corporate reputations in some instances than they are in protecting the privacy of their customers, at least in terms of the kind of disclosures that they engage in, that may ultimately pressure them to engage in some kind of change. And we've seen it work, so that with the advent of sort of the Facebooks and Twitters and Microsofts and Google's transparency reports, I think it's instructive to note that Google was the first, and full credit and fairness to them. Twitter followed, but many of the other major internet companies held off and did not engage. In fact, I recall a meeting I had with some of the privacy people at Facebook that said they didn't see the value in it and didn't think they were going to do it. And then, as these issues escalated and public concern escalated, they came to the realization that there was some value, some of it PR, but ultimately also some value to their subscribers. I wish that we could see that our Canadian companies might do the same.
Fantastic. Michael Geist, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.